It's November 10th, 1966, backstage at the Royal Albert Hall in London, England. Cunard's chairman, Basil Smallpeice, dabs the sweat off his forehead with a handkerchief. He's about to give a speech to the Institute of Directors on the changes he's making at Cunard and the lessons his experience can offer the rest of Britain. More than 4,000 business leaders are packed into the hall waiting for him. They're listening to another speaker right now, but he's wrapping up, and Basil is due on stage next and growing nervous. Glancing at his notes, he mutters some lines from his speech, rehearsing. In this country, we seem to lack the stamina to cap a good beginning. To cap a good beginning and see things through. We seem to lack guts. We seem to be missing the resource and the courage to adapt ourselves to the modern world. Sounds serious. Basil turns to see his wife, Kay. Oh, don't poke fun. Kay smiles at him reassuringly and straightens out his tie. She can tell he's nervous. You've rehearsed as much as I've seen anyone rehearse anything. You could give that speech in your sleep by now. I think I could too. Oh, I just don't belong on stage. I'm an accountant. We're not exactly known for our oratory excellence. Basil, you haven't been an accountant in decades. You're a leader, and you belong out there. Oh, I don't know about that. I'm still worried about this opening line. Why are you smiling? I'm not. You are. It's just funny to see you so worked up. I hardly ever get to see it. So, all right, go on. I'm listening. Okay. One of the basic features of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection is adaptability. Animals that don't adapt become extinct. The same goes for human institutions. The higher the development of the institution, the greater the need to modify. What do you think? Basil looks at Kay. Well, that was 4 lines. Fine, but how was it? Terribly boring. I'm sure they'll love it. Can I do a little more for you? No, they'll want you on stage any moment, darling. I'm just struggling with this opener. In the dawn of new experience and the sunshine of spectacular success. This is Cunard's day of reckoning. We must adapt or go under. Go under. But when Basil looks at his wife, Kay seems proud. You know, you don't give yourself enough credit. It was all right then? Yes, it was all right. I think that's your cue. I suppose it must be. Break a leg, darling. And remember, breathe and slow down. Basil Smallpeice's speech to the Institute of Directors made newspaper headlines all across the country. It was a damning criticism of Britain in the 1960s and a rallying call for action. He said the country had not found its place in the world following the loss of its empire and that it would have to change to survive. The speech was well received. And after all his practice, Basil appeared confident in front of his colleagues. Underneath his cool exterior, though, he wondered if he would truly be able to save Cunard, or if his company was doomed to go the way of the British Empire and become just another relic of the past. From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. When Basil Smallpeice received the offer to join the struggling Cunard Line in 1964, he was still reeling from his forced resignation as chief executive at the British Overseas Airways Corporation. But after a brief sabbatical, Basil found that he couldn't resist the challenge that Cunard represented. It was almost poetic. At the British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC, Basil had helped introduce the passenger jets that had supplanted ocean liners and seemingly doomed companies like Cunard. Now Basil was tasked with taming the monster he'd helped create. For more than a century, Cunard had made most of its profits ferrying people back and forth between Britain and North America by sea. But by the 1960s, that part of the business was hemorrhaging money. Basil knew that the company couldn't go on offering its year-round service on the North Atlantic. There just wasn't enough demand. But Basil still believed Cunard had another attractive product it could sell: leisure travel. He hoped that the company's new ship, codenamed Q4, would help Cunard transition from the traditional transatlantic routes to shorter cruises and warmer waters. But it wasn't only Cunard's passenger business that Basil planned to modernize. Cunard operated two main cargo subsidiaries, the Port Line, serving Australia, and the Brocklebank Line, serving India. But both were only marginally profitable, however, and plagued by logistical issues. Basil hoped a new approach to shipping would solve both of those problems. Containerization promised to slash Cunard's costs by radically streamlining the loading and unloading of cargo. Embracing this new method would be expensive, though. So Basil joined forces with three other small shipping companies to establish the Associated Container Transportation Consortium, or ACT. The pooled resources of the ACT would ease the strain on Cunard's fragile finances, but the transition to container ships would still take several years, as would the construction of the leisure ship Q4. Basil thought he just had to keep the company's head above water until his reforms and initiatives finally paid off. But in the middle of 1966, a new and unexpected crisis would emerge, one which would threaten to undo all of Basil's hard work. Cunard's staff would stop working, their ships would stop sailing, and Basil's hopes would start sinking. This is the third episode in our four-part series on Cunard, the New Queen. It's May 16, 1966, at a dock in Liverpool, England, 6 months before Basil Smallpeice's speech at the Royal Albert Hall. Basil looks around, addressing the situation. He's come here on one of his regular visits to the Cunard cargo operation in Liverpool, but the entire dock is deserted. The National Union of Seamen has just announced a strike, and most of Cunard's employees have answered the call to the picket line. Basil hears a sign of life behind him and turns to see one worker who's come to collect some belongings. When the man catches sight of Basil, though, he looks away nervously, picking up his pace. Basil calls after him.
Excuse me, do you have a moment?
The worker stops and turns reluctantly. Basil catches up with him.
Are you one of the striking workers? You're management, aren't you? I'm really not supposed to speak with you. What's that? I'll have to be carrying on. Well, no, wait, just a moment. They'll tear up my membership card. We're to have no contact with management of any company. Well, I'm not just management, I'm the chairman.
The other man's eyes widen.
Then I definitely shouldn't be speaking with you. Good day, sir. No, stay. I just want to know what's going on. What's the feeling among the workers? You suppose the strike will last a long time?
The worker glances around nervously. Basil tries to reassure him.
Look, there's no one else here. Just a few seagulls. They're not going to tell a soul. Neither will I.
The man gives a pained expression, but then finally speaks.
Well, there are some strong feelings about this, sir. I can imagine. We get paid £14 a week. You know that? For 56 hours. It's not right. Well, I do appreciate what you do for Cunard, but surely if your union leaders get round the table with the right attitude, we can sort all of this out.
The man bristles.
Well, maybe it's your representatives at the Shipping Federation who need to sort out their attitude.
Basil immediately realizes he's taken the wrong approach and softens his tone.
Well, sadly, I have little influence there. You know, I worked in airlines before this, and we dealt directly with our unions. Now, there's nothing I can do. Legally, I have to hand all responsibility over to the Federation. They're the ones who can negotiate with your officials. So you're not meant to be talking with me either. No, I suppose I'm not. I'll have to rely on your discretion, too.
The two men look at each other for a moment. Then quietly, the worker says,
Well, I'll tell you this, sir, and then I should go. The union is ready to ride this out. For how long?
The man shrugs.
Don't know. As long as it takes. Well, thank you for your time, and I won't detain you any further. And remember, I didn't see you, and you didn't see me.
The man nods, raising the collar of his coat, and heads back toward the street. As he reaches the dock exit, though, he turns back.
You said you worked in airlines? Yeah, that's right. Maybe you should ask for your old job back.
A few hours after Basil Smallpeice's encounter with his employee, the dock came back to life, not with men ready to work, but with union members holding picket signs. Until this point, Basil had recognized the challenges facing Cunard, but he had still felt confident in his ability to turn things around. Now, though, he was cut off from his employees, and his ships were all floating idly at the dockside. Basil wondered if this strike meant that all his efforts to turn the company around would be wasted. He was used to taking action, to making a difference. But now there was nothing he could do but watch the losses mount. The National Union of Seamen had gone on strike after negotiations broke down with the Shipping Federation, the group representing Britain's shipowners. The dispute centered on working hours and pay. The workers received just 5 shillings an hour. That was almost 50% lower than the wage of the average manual labor at the time and the equivalent of a little over $7 per hour today, less than the current federal minimum wage. This strike affected the entire British shipping industry, and with it at a standstill, it wouldn't be long before the rest of the British economy ground to a halt as well. The government in London was deeply concerned. As an island nation, Britain was highly dependent on imports arriving by sea. Now, it was as if a foreign enemy had suddenly blockaded all its ports. By early June 1966, almost 700 ships were stuck in port and 20,000 seamen across the country on strike. The politicians tried to help the two sides in the dispute negotiate, but compromise proved elusive. Finally, the government declared a state of emergency, allowing it to deploy the military to load and unload ships if necessary. And this fatally undermined the union's bargaining position. After 6 weeks of protest, the accumulation of lost wages and the steadfastness of the government and shipping federation proved too much. On July 1, 1966, the union admitted defeat. There would be no increase in wages or reduction in hours. But the striking workers weren't the only ones to suffer. The shutdown caused massive losses for the shipping companies. And in total, the strike cost Cunard nearly £4 million, around $110 million today, pushing the year's total projected losses to around £6 million, leaving Basil Smallpeice worried that Cunard was about to go bankrupt. Other businesses might have been tempted to sugarcoat such dire figures. In the past, shipping companies have been especially reluctant to publicly share financial information. But Basil thought this was wrong. He knew that if he was to stand any chance of saving the company, he would need patience and support from Cunard's shareholders. The only way to get that, he believed, was through transparency and honesty. So while most of his staff were still on the picket lines, Basil sat down to write his first annual report as Cunard chairman. Basil decided to spell out exactly where Cunard's losses had come from and the costs and revenues of each arm of the company. The resulting 1966 Cunard financial report was unprecedented in the industry. In Basil's own words, he was far more frank than many other chairmen would have been. And the Daily Mail newspaper remarked that it may be well rated as the finest clinical appraisal of the shipping industry yet undertaken and put on record. The report was so remarkable that Basil was invited to speak about it to a national organization for business leaders called the Institute of Directors. The theme of Basil's speech in November 1966 was adaptability to change. And in Basil's opinion, it wasn't just his company, Cunard, that needed to evolve. He saw echoes of his firm's struggles up and down the country. Britain had relinquished its empire in the 1940s and 50s, but according to Basil, it was living above its means in the 1960s. In his eyes, the country had failed to adapt to modern times, and its struggling economy was proof of that. Prompt action was needed to turn things around, even if that meant some difficult decisions had to be made. And soon, Basil would be forced to practice what he preached. Earlier in the decade, before he joined the company, Cunard had entered into a partnership with Basil's former employer, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC. This joint venture had been the result of Cunard trying to diversify out of its traditional businesses and grab a slice of the growing market for air travel. After some early troubles, by 1966, BOAC Cunard was finally turning a profit. That year, BOAC asked Cunard to help finance the purchase of new aircraft. But with the shipping company struggling in the wake of the strike, Cunard just did not have the capital on hand. So Basil was left with a decision to make. It seemed to him that BOAC Cunard was a hangover from an earlier corporate strategy that was no longer relevant. Besides, the joint venture was run entirely by the other company and didn't even provide job opportunities for Cunard employees. And now, with Cunard no longer able to keep up its financial obligations, Basil looked for a permanent way out. In the fall of 1966, he struck a deal with BOAC to sell Cunard's interest in the joint venture for £11.5 million. This agreement meant that Cunard recovered its initial £8.5 million investment and made a £3 million profit on top. This windfall helped offset Cunard's 1966 losses, much needed oxygen for a drowning business. And with this cash infusion in the bank, Basil hoped Cunard could survive long enough for the next stage of his strategy to bear fruit. On the cargo side of the business, Basil was still pursuing containerization through his new conglomerate, the ACT. But while he waited on the long process of converting Cunard's ships and docks to this new system, Basil didn't want to sit on his hands. And in fact, he couldn't. Brocklebank, a Cunard cargo subsidiary, was in trouble. When Basil first took over at Cunard, Brocklebank had seemed in good health. It had turned a small profit, and Basil was impressed by its management team. But the world was shifting around Brocklebank as well. The bulk of its business was in shipping to and from South Asia. That had been a lucrative trade route when Britain had ruled India. But they had gained their independence in 1947, and ever since then, Brocklebank's long-term prospects had been in doubt. Now, increased competition was squeezing revenues even more. And with the cargo business smaller than it once was, Basil could see no reason to continue incurring the overhead of maintaining a separate management team for Brocklebank. So he consolidated operations with Cunard's main office, cutting costs and improving the bottom line. But if trade with India was failing, Basil spied an opportunity with another of Britain's former imperial possessions. Since 1914, Cunard's other cargo subsidiary, the Port Line, had been transporting cargo between Britain and Australia. Mostly, it had been British exports heading down under. But Australia was growing rapidly in the 1960s and beginning to produce large quantities of iron ore and other potentially valuable exports. Basil realized that Australia wouldn't want to rely on foreign shipping companies alone much longer. It would want Australian goods to be carried on Australian ships. Cunard, though, was a proudly British firm through and through. So somehow Basil Smallpeice would have to square that circle. Because if he didn't, Cunard would miss out on this lucrative emerging market and take yet one more step closer to disaster. It's February 1967 and Canberra, Australia, 7 months after the strike by British shipping workers. On the spacious terrace of an upscale restaurant, Basil Smallpeice watches as a waiter refills the wine glass of Australia's Secretary of Trade and Industry, 53-year-old Sir Alan Westerman. Basil has traveled down under on a delicate mission. He wants the Australian government to invest in Cunard's cargo arm, the Port Line. But he needs Alan on his side for this, and Alan knows it. Oh, you know what would be perfect after such a big steak? A nice cigar. You bring any cigars with you, Basil? No, I'm afraid not. Oh, too bad. I think I brought something rather more interesting, though. Ah, scotch. No, not whiskey either. You palms always dancing around what you have to say. Come on, let's hear it then. Well, I was told you don't care for British ship owners. And I can quite understand why. As a collective, we've worked to keep Australia out of the international deep-sea trade for years. That's right, you have. We've got some fine companies working up and down our coasts, but you lot have helped lock them out of anything more. Well, I think it's a very short-sighted way of looking at things. Australia's economy is growing. You're a global player now, and it's time you had a proper international shipping operation. It's true, but... see, yeah, always a but. But building up an international shipping company is hard work. It's far more complicated than just carrying goods within your own territory. And it's not simply a matter of buying the right ships. You have to find reliable crews and suppliers, make agreements with different ports and governments. I know there's red tape, Basil. Crikey, I work in government. Well, what if I told you that there was a way Australia could have its own shipping company without the hassle? All right, go on. I would like the Australian government to purchase a stake in Cunard's Port Line. Alan leans back in his chair, taking a moment to digest this pitch. It's an intriguing and unexpected offer. Oh, I'd have to consider the politics of that. These would still be British ships. No, there's a positive story here you can tell. This is Australia's time. You're not a colony anymore, dependent on the mother country sending supplies across the ocean. And what better way to show that than taking a stake in a British company as a partner, equal in esteem and standing? That'd be a boon to national pride, I should think. Yeah, but what's in it for Cunard, though? You're not suggesting this out of the goodness of your heart. Of course not. Obviously, we retain a substantial stake in the Port Line and take our share of its success. But with your local expertise, I'm certain the company can also expand more rapidly here. So you see, it's good for both of us. You get access to our international operation, and we get a bigger slice of the thriving Australian market. Alan sits in silence for a moment. Basil remains silent too, patiently sipping his wine. Finally, Alan tosses a napkin onto the table and looks Basil straight in the eye. Well, you know what, Basil, you're right. I don't like British ship owners, but maybe you're right about some other things as well. This is not a yes. It's a little early for wedding bells, but let's start the process and see where it leads us. Basil smiles and raises his glass. Well, to new partnerships then. To new partnerships. But Basil, have you ever considered a career in politics? Oh, only in my nightmares. There are enough sharks for me out at sea. Basil Smallpeice had made a promising start to negotiations with the Australian government, but his proposal would soon become bogged down in bureaucracy of its own and political wrangling both in Australia and Britain, forcing Basil once again into a position of being patient and hoping that his efforts would eventually pay off. In the meantime, though, Cunard's already shaky finances were about to take another hit. In the summer of 1967, Cunard's accounting department informed the company's chairman, Basil Smallpeice, that passenger numbers were again falling below forecast. The roughly 20% decline seemed to be part of a larger global recession in luxury goods and services. Cunard's accountants calculated that as a result, the company was projected to lose another £3.5 million on its passenger ships in 1967. Making matters worse, construction costs on Cunard's new liner, codenamed Q4, were rising as well. And this was bad news. Basil had pinned his hopes on this new dual-purpose ship. The Q4 would operate as a liner during the summer months, when there was still some demand from passengers wanting to cross the Atlantic the old-fashioned way. But in the winter, the new Cunard ship would chase the sun as a cruise vessel. Advances in engine technology would allow the Q4 to reach the same speeds as her predecessors while cutting fuel consumption by half. This was projected to save Cunard £1 million annually in fuel costs alone, and the Q4 was slightly smaller than her predecessors as well. That would allow the new ship to fit through the Panama Canal to reach the Pacific. Her shallower draft would also enable her to call at ports which the bigger, older liners simply couldn't enter. But all these improvements came at a cost. The Q4 had been forecast at a price of over £25 million, nearly $800 million today. This was far more than Cunard could afford, and the British government had stepped in with a loan to cover over 2/3 of the construction cost. But even that would no longer be enough. Basil's accountants informed him that the latest cost projections were coming in almost 15% higher than the original estimates. So just when Basil thought that profits in 1968 looked possible, this news changed everything. Basil's original plan had been to keep Cunard's most famous passenger liners in service until the new ship was finished. The Queen Mary was to retire in October 1968, and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, would follow a year later. But the recent collapse in revenues meant that Cunard could no longer afford to keep the old ships in service for so long. The two vast liners were decades old, and their maintenance costs were only increasing. So Basil made the decision to retire both ships a year earlier than planned. It was a devastating announcement. Hundreds of Cunard staff were employed on the two Queens, and they had long known that there wouldn't be places for all of them on the new ship, which was smaller and more efficient. Half of them stood to lose their jobs, and now those layoffs would happen even sooner than expected. These impending job losses troubled Basil. To him, Cunard's impeccable staff had been a light in the darkness when it seemed the company had little else going for it. Their spirits had remained high despite all the difficulties of recent years, and their loyalty to the company had been admirable. Now Basil felt like he was betraying them, but he also knew he had little choice. To preserve morale, Basil stuck to the philosophy he used with his shareholders: transparency and honesty. He began publishing a newsletter to keep employees informed about the company's future and to explain his decisions to them. Among the first announcements he had to explain was his plan for the two retiring Queens. Many other great ocean liners were being sold off or scrapped at this time, and there was a great deal of public debate about how to give these ships a fitting farewell. One famous former liner, the Ile-de-France, was even used as a set for a Hollywood disaster film. Production saw the ship ripped apart, blown up and half sunk, causing outrage in France, where the liner had been iconic. Basil didn't want to cause a similar controversy, but he still felt that the best use of the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth now was to sell them and raise funds for their successor. So in the summer of 1967, the first of the old ships went on sale. The auction of the RMS Queen Mary was a somber event. There were several bidders, but ultimately, the city of Long Beach, California won out with its offer of almost $3.5 million, the equivalent of $33 million today. Long Beach planned to use the Queen Mary as a floating tourist attraction and maritime museum, but the city insisted on there being a proper ceremonial handover. It wanted to welcome the ship to its new home in a blaze of glory. So the last voyage of the Queen Mary had to be a real one, with passengers lining the rails just as they had so many times before. For Basil and the Cunard team, though, this was a logistical nightmare. The Queen Mary was too large to fit through the Panama Canal, and this meant that in order to get to California from England, the ocean liner needed to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America. The 31-year-old Queen Mary was built for transatlantic crossings, a journey that took under a week. Her voyage around the notoriously stormy Cape Horn, however, was scheduled to take over a month. Basil and other Cunard leaders tried to warn the Long Beach representatives that the trip was not a good idea, but they wouldn't hear of it. They insisted on the arduous final voyage, and they got their way. Travel agents were soon marketing the trip as the last great cruise, and more than 1,000 passengers bought tickets. So the Queen Mary set off from Southampton on October 31st, 1967, to the tune of passengers singing Auld Lang Syne. But the festive atmosphere on board didn't last long. Gale-force winds between France and Spain buffeted the ship, causing many passengers to become seasick. Things only got worse as the ship crossed the equator. The Queen Mary had been designed for the cooler climate of the North Atlantic. In hot weather, her hull was like an oven. It was miserable for everyone on board, and the heat became so intense that one crew member died. So at every port the liner called at, more and more passengers abandoned the voyage. Only a fraction remained when the Queen Mary finally arrived in Long Beach in December 1967. But despite the difficult voyage, the old liner was welcomed with fanfare. An airplane bombarded her with flowers, and crowds of people cheered and wept as the ship made its way into the harbor where it is still moored today. Basil Smallpeice did not partake in any of the festivities. He had too much to do. Cunard's new liner, the Q4, was nearly ready for its launch and final fitting out. That meant it would soon be time for Basil to pay the shipbuilders. But when he crunched the numbers, he realized that Cunard was coming up short, even after selling the Queen Mary. This was a potential catastrophe. All of Basil's plans for the future of the company rested on the success of the Q4. The launch was just weeks away, and Queen Elizabeth II herself would be attending the ceremony. Basil had to find more money, but he was running out of time. It's August 1967, inside a government building in London, England, a month before the launch of Cunard's new liner, the Q4. Basil Smallpeice follows a secretary down to the end of an anonymous gray hallway. Their shoes squeak on the linoleum floor. It's a hot day, and even the walls seem to have a sheen of sweat on them.
Come.
Basil nods his thanks to the secretary, and then steps into a small and airless corner office. Tall government official named Peter Brummels unfolds himself from his chair and rises from the desk to shake Basil's hand.
Mr. Smallpeice, would you care for a cup of tea? Oh, no, thank you.
Yes, it is a little warm for today, perhaps. It's these windows, you see. I think they're painted shut. But regardless, please, take a seat. The two men sit, and Peter continues. Now, you spoke of some urgency on the telephone.
Yes, indeed.
Considerable urgency, actually. I need our loan increased to $24 million, and I need the money expedited. Peter raises his eyebrows.
Well, that is a fairly significant increase from the original amount.
$17.6 million.
Yes, I'm well aware. The recession has affected our passenger business, and the cost of our new ship has increased unexpectedly. Without this additional financing, construction on the Q4 will have to be stopped.
Oh, I see. And the Cunard Line is unable to make up even a part of this shortfall?
Not at this moment, no.
I see. We are well on our way to profitability in the long run, especially on the cargo side. I can show you projections. I'll even take you to a container terminal if you'd like. And the Q4 is certainly going to boost the passenger side.
I see. She really is a magnificent ship.
Basil watches anxiously as Peter scribbles some notes. And finally, Peter looks up at Basil.
Well, I shall pass this along. Do you know when I might hear an answer? It is most urgent, as I said. I'm sure we can expedite it. Why don't you come by next week for an update?
Next week?
Will that not work for you? I'm sure we can fit in the following week. No. I need the loan now. Mr. Smallpeice, we have to follow standard procedures. £7.5 million is no small sum of money.
It will have to be next week at the very earliest before we know more, but I shall certainly pass on your concerns. We need these funds by the 14th of September, or this ship may never be finished. I understand that you have commercial priorities, but we can't be beholden to those. Well, if we don't receive that money, it will have obvious political repercussions. One would be amazed at how many executives say the same thing when they come here. Everyone's a special case, I find. With respect to most of the public, Cunard ships represent Britain itself. They're named after our queens, after all. If we're building new ships, the economy is strong. If construction has to be paused, the economy must be weak. Britain must be weak. To Basil's irritation, Peter's face betrays no emotion. He just smiles blandly. I see. Well, I shall certainly pass that along, yes, I know. Well, thank you for your help. Loan negotiations between Basil Smallpeice and the British government continued throughout the rest of August 1967. Each time Basil met with officials, he pressed upon them the urgency of the matter. And each time, the officials prevaricated. The days ticked by and the launch of the Q4 grew closer. And yet still, Basil did not have the money he needed. By September 13, 1967, the launch of the new Cunard ocean liner Q4 was just a week away. But no word on the loan extension was coming through official channels, so Basil Smallpeice decided it was time to cut through the red tape. He and some of his senior colleagues requested a private meeting with Harold Lever, Britain's financial secretary to the Treasury. Harold agreed to meet and invited the Cunard team to his home. At the meeting, Harold listened attentively as Basil laid out what was at stake. Basil emphasized yet again that if additional funding from the British government did not come through in time, Cunard would almost certainly have to reject delivery of the Q4 from the shipbuilders. Precisely what would happen then, even Basil couldn't say. But the publicity would certainly be appalling. Cunard shareholders would be horrified, and the entire future of the company would be in doubt. Hearing all this, Harold appeared sympathetic. He promised to consult his colleagues in government urgently and give Basil a definitive answer by the next day. Basil and the Cunard executives had to prepare for the worst, though. A board meeting was arranged for the following afternoon, and as they waited on word from Harold, they discussed what they might do should the government decline their request. After some debate, the board and Basil concluded that Cunard would likely have to liquidate its assets and shut down the company. After more than 125 years in business and having survived 2 world wars, this was the greatest crisis Cunard had ever known. Then, in the middle of this grim conversation, a letter arrived at Cunard's head office. It was from Harold Lever. He had negotiated with his colleagues in the Treasury and arranged for Cunard's loan to be increased from £17.6 million to £24 million. The Cunard men in the boardroom roared with relief as Basil read out the letter. The company was saved. With funding secured, the shipbuilders could be paid and the Q4 could be launched by the Queen on schedule. The new liner could then have its final internal fittings installed and be made ready for its maiden voyage. Advertising campaigns were already being prepared, and with anticipation growing among the public at the prospect of a new ship, there was hope after all that Cunard could once again achieve profits. Despite a damaging strike, slumping revenues, and the premature retirement of its most famous ship, the Cunard Line was still afloat. Basil's reforms had saved the company millions of pounds and staved off bankruptcy just long enough for the Q4 to come to the company's rescue. The ship was a sleek and striking mixture of old and new, with a traditional dark hull and white superstructure of a Cunard liner married with a swept-back prow more reminiscent of a luxury yacht. But the ship that was supposed to lead Cunard into a bright new future would soon risk dragging the company back into the problems of the past. As the date of Q4's planned maiden voyage neared, problems would emerge with Cunard's gleaming new flagship. Malfunctioning machinery and unfinished interiors would see the liner's debut delayed, and the ship which Basil Smallpeice had worked so hard to get afloat might soon be in danger of being dead in the water. From Wondery, this is episode 3 of Steering Cunard Off the Rocks for Business Movers. On the next episode, Queen Elizabeth II christens Cunard's grand new liner and delivers an unexpected surprise. Meanwhile, Basil Smallpeice must race against the clock in order to get the ship ready in time for the travel season. If you'd like to learn more about Basil Smallpeice and Cunard, we recommend Of Comets and Queens by Basil Smallpeice, The Only Way to Cross by John Maxton Graham, and Transatlantic by Stephen Fox. A quick note about our dramatizations. In most cases, we can't know everything that happened, but all our reenactments are based on historical research. Business Movers is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Mohammed Shazib. Sound design by Molly Bach. Music by Lindsey Graham. Additional writing for this episode by Cody Hoffmuck. Associate producer Jake Sampson. Executive producers are William Simpson for Airship and Aaron O'Flaherty, Jenny Lauer Beckman, and Marshall Louie for Wondery.